Hey, what is up guys? This is Nishi from MST.TV here, back with another Market Watch episode. So today we're going over a few more cards that have been trending over the course of the last week or so. For the most part, we're continuing to look at price spikes resulting from that crazy ban list that we got earlier this week. But of course, there was also a couple of neat things coming from over in the OCG, with the release of the Wild Survivors side set, and some old cards starting to see play over there as well. A lot of these cards that we're going to talk about were trending earlier on in the week, but of course, the ban list was our priority when getting this Market Watch out to you. However, I still want to make sure that everyone is aware of these important cards. Let's get started. Alright, so the first card we're taking a look at for today is Kashtira-Theosis. So I know that we've only even had this card for about a week, but Kashtira-Theosis' price history has already been on a bit of a roller coaster. Now early on this card was at around $70 to $80, which I think is reasonable for where we were expecting this card to be. From there, the card's price did start to drop, and it was down at around $60 to $65. However, the most recent ban list actually caused a lot of players to turn and think that Kashtira will be the best deck of the upcoming format, since both Tearlament and Sprite were hit relatively hard. Because of this, a lot of people kind of freaked out and went to buy a bunch of Kashtira cards, with Kashtira-Theosis being one of the primary targets, causing it to spike all the way back up in price to the $85 to $90 mark. Since then, it has cooled off a little bit in the past couple of days to where it's now holding a steady $70 price tag. I think that we should expect this card to continue to drop a bit further, probably down to between $50 and $60, although maybe if Kashtira is an extremely dominant strategy, it could be a little bit higher than that. Overall though, I think that Kashtira will just be a really strong deck in the format, maybe not as dominant or overpowered as some players might be afraid of, given those other hits. If you guys want to play Kashtira at a big event in the next couple of weeks, then you should probably grab this card as soon as you can, but realistically, if you guys are okay with waiting for a few weeks or so, I would hold off on buying this card right now because it's still recovering from the initial hit of banlist hype, combined with the fact that the card was literally just released, and I think that in a few weeks you will be able to get the card at a much more affordable price. The next card we have here is No Punk Ogre Dance. Now a week or two ago we talked about Foxytune, a card that was a key piece of the Punk engine, and while it has been quite a while since we saw all of the Punk Adventurer pile type of decks, it seems that the Punk engine has been starting to catch people's attention, and some players are considering picking it up to use. Now historically, Ogre Dance isn't a card that has seen a ton of play. You can discard Ogre Dance to search for a non-level 8 Punk monster, which might be a good way to grab a Z-Amen. And you can also special summon this card out by tributing any one Punk monster. Now before, the Punk engine tried to be a little bit more compact, as you really only wanted to either go down that E-Telly route with Z-Amen, or you would use a Foxytune line and then you would go into an Auroradon. Now however, I suppose that players are looking at a bigger Punk engine, and Ogre Dance is a consistency card for the engine because it functions basically like a Rhoda. Because of this, we did see a really big spike in the price of Ogre Dance, as it went from being $3 or $4 a few weeks ago to now being $12 for a single copy. I don't know just how dominant this engine is going to be or where exactly people are thinking it's going to see usage, but Ogre Dance was only a few dollars, so it's definitely now a card that is worth noting. Do keep in mind though that Grand Creators has been out for about a year, and in the same way that I feel like the Adventurer token package could all be reprinted soon, it's certainly possible that Ogre Dance and the rest of the Punk cards could be reprinted as well, so definitely be cautious when you're holding too many copies of each of these cards. Next up, let's really quickly talk about Branded Fusion. So after the ban list, there were a lot of players that were actually thinking that Branded might go back to being one of the best decks of this upcoming format. With Sprite and Tearlaments hit severely, it's literally Kashtira and then everything else, with any number of decks being able to step up and take one of those top spots. Branded Despia, with or without Bystials, is something that I think a lot of players are considering. Branded Despia was a really good deck up until the release of Power of the Elements, which just kind of power crept Branded Despia out of the game, since I don't think the deck has even really seen any banlist hits at all. Branded Fusion is absolutely one of the most important cards for the deck. I think that ideally, if you're playing Branded Despia, you want to be able to resolve Branded Fusion every single turn, and alternatively, if you're playing against the deck, you're probably holding onto your copy of Ash Blossom to use it on Branded Fusion. However, this card only has the one structure deck printing, despite how a lot of other cards from the archetype have actually gotten multiple different reprints. Because of this, it is worth noting that the Branded Fusions alone are $3 each, and it's definitely on people's radar because on February 6th, someone bought 165 copies at $2.61 each, and then there were other sold listings for 19, 36, and 61 copies. I don't know if that was all the same person or what, but that's a lot of copies of Branded Fusion. It's also worth noting that the structure deck contains other key cards such as Lubellion and Mirror Jade and Mercurier, so if you're thinking of playing the deck, keep an eye on your locals because I feel like a lot of people are going to want to pick this deck up sealed so that they can play the theme. One other potentially meta-relevant card to mention here is Sword Soul of Moyi. So Sword Souls, much like Branded Despia, are one of those decks that just kind of fell off on its own. Yes, we saw Protos banned, but that card was a bit degenerate, and the deck, even after the hit, was still really strong. However, it just wasn't enough to keep up with some of the other big archetypes. From there, everyone just seemed to kind of forget about Sword Soul completely, to the point where most of the archetype was reprinted in Magnificent Mavens, but no one really cared about any of it at all. Now, however, with this unexpected room within the format, Sword Soul might be able to prove itself as a top tier deck once again, and a lot of players are looking to pick it up as a relatively budget option. Moyi is of course a key card for the deck, as it draws you a card if it's used as synchro material and sent to the graveyard, and all you have to do to summon the token with its own effect is reveal another Sword Soul or Worm card from your hand. Initially, the Ultras were really cheap, right? They were only $2 to $3 because they were out of Magnificent Mavens and so many people tore into that set, but now those ultra rare reprints are up at $8 to $9 a piece, and then of course the original secret rares are quite expensive still, up at $30 for a near mint copy from a verified seller. If you guys opened up Magnificent Mavens, it may have been really easy to overlook a couple of copies of Moyi and some other Sword Soul cards. I'd actually recommend seeing if you can put the cores together and then selling them as a whole, since there's probably a lot of newer or more inexperienced players that might be just looking to pick up everything together all at once, especially if their old Tearlament deck no longer feels usable. Alright, we've looked at some random cards on Market Watch in the past, things like Mushroom Man number 2, but I think that this one is definitely up there as well. It is Frostosaurus. So we are only talking about the ultimate rare version here. I just don't like showing the ultimate rares in the video or thumbnail because it's usually pretty difficult to see clearly what card it is we're talking about. But apparently, Frostosaurus is a card that can be used by the Transcendrake archetype, a new theme that is coming out in World Survivors, one of the upcoming side sets. That archetype wants to use Frostosaurus because it's a specifically level 6 vanilla dinosaur monster. There are actually 5 different level 6 vanilla dinosaurs in the game, but 2 of them are pendulum scales. However, Frostosaurus has 2600 attack points and is the strongest one, so it gets the nod here. It's kind of like how back when Brilliant Fusion was a thing, everyone wanted to use Garnet because it had 1900 attack points, which was actually a pretty big deal and allowed it to run over things, so it was much more highly sought after than the next best option. Now, I'm not saying that Transcendrakes have anything as good as Brilliant Fusion, but they're definitely a strong archetype that could do something at a large event. Naturally, people decided to drop everything and chase after ultimate rare copies of Frostosaurus, which as an old ultimate rare vanilla monster, there aren't many copies of available. Right now there's barely any near mint copies for sale on TCG Player. I think there's only one up at $70. If you look at the sold listings though, all of the sold versions are around that $40 to $50 range for a near mint copy. Still high, but a bit more reasonable than $70. If you guys happen to have this card lying around, then please go sell it and take advantage of the hype. Fortunately, this card has several common and rare printings that are still easily accessible, and even there's a mosaic rare copy available if you want to bling your deck out just a little bit without spending too much crazy money. Speaking of the Transcendrakes, the next card we're talking about is Evilzar Solda. This card is a rank 6 Xyz monster that requires 2 dinosaurs to make, This is actually a very specific requirement and isn't something that very many decks have been able to actually go into up until now. It just so happens that this card can be made in the Transcendrake deck, and this just might be a nice monster to end your board with. It can't be destroyed by card effects while it has Xyz material, and also if your opponent special summons a monster, you can detach a material from this card to destroy that monster. So not completely crazy because it doesn't negate the summon or anything like that, but it does still destroy monsters and it isn't a once per turn effect. This card is definitely a more situational extra deck option. In fact, I think that, for example, in Lithium's list, he didn't use the card at all, but this card did get some hype from people who got to read the cards first, and were just thinking of cards to try to buy out. The other thing is that we never actually saw this card get a reprint. It was only ever printed in Photon Shockwave as an ultra rare and an ultimate rare. For the ultimate rare first editions, they're about $22, and the Ulti Unlimiteds are around $14. Fortunately, the ultras are still quite cheap at only around $5 each. This is still a lower price than what we saw before, as initially the ultimate rares had spiked way up to $40 per copy. Now personally, I'm not sold on this card at all. I think that this is just going to be one of those cards that people initially try to hype up to move some old cards that have been sitting around for a long time, but then it's not really going to see any play. If this card is really supposed to get used by the Transcendrake archetype, then theoretically it'll get reprinted in either Wild Survivors or an OTS tournament pack around that time. So I think that what makes the most sense is to just offload the card for now if you can still find someone who wants to buy into the Transcendrake hype. And finally, the last card to talk about for today is Xyz Encore. So this is a card that we've talked about quite a few times over the past several years. It always seems to pop up whenever a really good Xyz based strategy pops into the game. Apparently in the OCG, Xyz Encore is cited because of the Pearly deck. The deck tries to sit on X Pearly Noir with a bunch of materials, but Xyz Encore getting rid of the materials before returning it to the extra deck gets around the clause of X Pearly Noir being immune to card effects, since getting rid of the materials isn't the same thing as affecting the card. Apparently this is because of a precedent set by number 86, Rongo Miniad. So apparently this card is a thing, and even though Pearly isn't a full deck here yet, it very well could be in just a couple of months once it gets those additional support cards from Cyberstorm Access. Because of that, Xyz Encore is now a solid $7 to $8 card for either its original printing from Judgment of the Light or the Megatin reprint. Now believe it or not, despite being almost a decade old, those are the only two printings of the card, and this is something that we've seen pop up multiple times over the past few years. However, I would be really hesitant about picking this card up. Every time we think it's going to be good, something better always ends up popping up, especially things that have more than just the one application against one specific strategy. Like even with this one, I think you could realistically just play a Kaiju instead, and that could be useful against virtually any of those other big monster decks, or just be used generally to break boards that are being set up by combo decks, right? So yeah, another time that this card is interesting in theory, but ultimately I think you are just better off dumping it while there's another wave of hype around it, because it will eventually get another reprint and become extremely affordable again. Alright guys, that is it for today's Market Watch. It has been a really crazy week for the Yu-Gi-Oh market. I've been seeing so many people talking about different aspects of the game, between new deck lists and hyping up new strategies and individual cards. I think that the game really needed that ban list to shake things up, because things were just getting so stale and honestly kind of boring. Anyways guys, if you did enjoy today's episode, please make sure that you let me know by hitting that thumbs up button. Also make sure you leave a comment in the comment section down below. Let me know what you guys think about the cards we talked about today and what other cards are trending on the market so that I can cover them in a future episode. And of course, if you haven't already, do make sure that you hit that subscribe button to get all of the latest and greatest content from both Tombox and myself. And until next time guys, don't forget to hold on to your MST.TV.